Hi there. Find yourself a comfortable space, take some time for yourself, and join me, Siobhan McLean, for a slice of supervision. Thank you very much for joining me, Claire. It's lovely to see you again, actually. And we've only ever met online, but I kind of don't feel that. And I think it shows that actually online relationships can be really helpful. COVID showed us that, didn't it, I suppose? So I wanted to invite you to come along and share a supervision slice because of your supervision chair. I always think of you as so creative as a supervisor, and I learned so much from you. And the chair, I don't know how I found out about the chair. Maybe we talked about it, maybe when we did a webinar together, maybe it was in development, I don't know. But I decided to use it with a student. It was so brilliant. I've used it ever since. I just think it's such an amazing tool. So I really wanted to do a slice where you could talk about the tool. So if you would like to start off maybe by introducing yourself to people watching this, and then we can see where we go from there. So,
okay. Thank you, Siobhan, and lovely to see you again as well. So my name's Claire Skilleter, and I am a practice educator and social worker, and I work in Norfolk as a practice education lead. So my job is really around supporting practice educators and on-site supervisors and social work students and apprentices when they're in placement, and I also practice educate students myself and mentor trainee practice educators.
So that's a very busy role. So a lot of your work is about practice education, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's why you developed the supervision chair for working with students. One thing I'd say, just so that people who aren't practice educators don't switch off straight away, is you can use this tool with everybody.
Absolutely.
I do supervision for lots of different people and some very senior managers. And I would use a supervision chair from a first placement student to a director of social services in a supervisory relationship, and find it really helpful. So do you want to tell people a little bit about where the idea of the chair came from and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, just to say, I totally agree. There's nothing in the supervision chair that can't be used with any worker at any level at all. And in fact, some local authorities have adopted it as their supervision agreement model across their whole staff group. So there isn't anything in there that wouldn't be transferable to use in any supervisory relationship. In terms of what it is, the supervision chair is a tool for creating a supervision agreement. So it's a visual and creative way of paying attention to how we set up and sustain a safe, secure, trusting, cooperative supervisory relationship. And I suppose I've always used supervision agreements in practice when I was a manager and as a practice educator and practice education lead. So I've always used supervision agreements, but my struggle with them was that they were often quite linear, quite prescriptive. They were something, you sort of did and then put away on somebody's file, and they were never really referred to again. And I suppose because, like you, I know, I try to work in a very relationship-based way. I try to be creative in practice and find different ways to engage with different learners and different supervisees, because of course we're all different. So the chair sort of came about because I was looking for a different way to very explicitly pay attention to trying to create a supervisory relationship that reflected a secure base, that reflected the sort of principles of the team as a secure base model. So, a supervision agreement that very much focused on sort of projecting those concepts of your supervisor being available and sensitive, accepting of people's different feelings and identities, of supervision being a really joint endeavour. So the supervisor and the supervisee are sharing things of themselves to develop an understanding of each other. And really that feeling that both parties, the supervisor and the supervisee, are equally committed to the supervision relationship and making it work. And I guess for me, my most successful supervisory relationships as a supervisor or a supervisee have been the ones where someone has really understood me as a person as well as a worker. And I part of my sort of inspiration, if you like, for the chair was my very first social care manager, who I call Elaine in the book where the supervision chair is published. But she, and this was like Siobhan, this was like 35 years ago, and she had her own office and she had 2 comfortable armchairs, and you only sat in them when you went in for supervision. And she had a little coffee table and there were biscuits and tissues on it, and it always looked the same when you went in. And we always started supervision in the same way. And she absolutely was, she shared a bit of herself. She was interested in me. She was always reliable, dependable. And I used to arrive at supervision often overwhelmed, not understanding something, a bit like I've just got too much to do and I don't know what I'm doing. And when I left the chair, I felt like, okay, I feel like I can go off now, continue. I've learned something maybe about myself or the people I work with. I feel contained. I feel like somebody's just sort of metaphorically held me, and I can go back out and do the work. So the supervision chair is a bit of a combination of what Elaine did for me, the chairs that we sat in, and secure based, relationship based practice sort of rolled into one. And each element of the chair, each part of the chair represents a different element of supervision, which you discuss as you set up your supervisory relationship, really.
See, I even just love the introduction there. So in a minute, we'll talk through the chair and how to use the chair. But I even love that because one of the things I feel quite strongly about is that the most significant influence on the supervision we provide is the supervision we receive. So, Elaine having that impact on you. I remember some of the best supervision that I ever had early in my career. And my supervisor would ask us all to bring in a piece of material that represented how we were feeling. And so now I use that kind of technique. And it does really, if you have good quality supervision, it does really influence the way you provide supervision. And I wonder whether now, so many people talk about receiving quite procedural, quite tick boxy type supervision, that then what happens is we're going to end up replicating that and it's going to become the norm, really. So I think it's really, it's just even lovely to hear that that's where it came from. And I also love the idea of you setting the chair up around the team as a secure base model, because I find that helpful when I'm even talking through the chair, because I'm an off-site practice educator, so I'm not in the team. So for me, I find it a particularly helpful tool to think about. And even if I'm supervising, a qualified worker, I'm not there. I'm not their line manager. I'm not there. So understanding how the team acts as the secure base, as well as my supervisory role within that, is really helpful with the chair. So I don't know, would you like to start to explain? I suppose in a way it's about the use of the chair as an analogy, isn't it? So it's that building that chair and having those really in-depth discussions. I suppose just one thing I'd say as well about what you were sharing there was when you said people often, certainly in the past, I think, would see a supervision agreement almost as a fill in the blanks, and then it just becomes a tick box exercise. What I say, and I don't know if I've got this right, I say when I'm delivering training, in authorities where they haven't yet adopted the chair across everything, is maybe still do that, still have that, still go through that process because it might be an important HR document or something, but then use the chair in addition to. So that's the way I would do it. I don't know what your thoughts are, but
yeah, absolutely. Really good point, because the chair doesn't cover things around procedure, policy, those sorts of things. So absolutely, if a local authority has a particular document that they have to use for those purposes, that's fine. I would see the supervision chair as a separate activity that is around the supervisory relationship and the person's needs as a supervisee, rather than maybe other documents that are important but that aren't directly related to the supervisory relationship.
Yeah. And what I do really like about it is it very much demonstrates this as a two-way thing that we have to build the chair together.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So do you want to start to explain how you build the chair and how you
Yeah.
use it? I'd be
Yeah.
really interested because I might use it in a different way. So that'll be really interesting.
Well, I guess that's the thing, and I'm always saying this to practice educators, for example, that actually any tool, it's not about the tool; it's about the person who uses the tool. That's where the magic is. I always say the magic's not in the tool; it's in the relationship. So people may well. I always say, don't be afraid to adapt it, and use it maybe slightly differently. So yeah, so it is you make a good point in that it is a reciprocal, it's a reciprocal agreement. It's around the fact that should we be asking any supervisee to do something that we're not prepared to do ourselves? So there are some discussions where I, as a supervisor, will share things around my social graces or my previous experiences that have impacted on me as a supervisor. So there's an element there of the importance of being comfortable with your own stuff and knowing how things impact on you. So in practice then, just to say, and then we'll talk about building the chair, you can do the chair in numerous ways. It's designed as a sort of visual approach. So you might paint or draw a chair on a large piece of paper and then write your discussions around the edge of the chair. There is a template, a Word document template of the supervision chair, if that feels more comfortable for people. I've had supervisees who have made 3D models of the chair with Lego, for example. The supervisee could be invited to bring a photograph of their really comfortable chair that they sit in at home. You could make a collage of pictures of chairs from online. So really, there's lots of there's no right or wrong way in terms of the piece of paper that it's on or the 3D model that it's on. I always offer it personally with students. I offer a choice about whether they want to do a supervision agreement in this way, and I talk to them about the theory behind it, etc. And I give them some thinking time to think about how they want to represent the chair in terms of 3D model or picture or whatever. So preparing somebody for the fact that this is the way, this is a possible way that we could do a supervision agreement and come in prepared for it. So I would give them the slides or the template before the supervision that we were going to do the chair on. So for students, I do that at a pre-placement meeting, so that they're prepared and they've got some sort of thinking time around that. And so we start with sort of building the supervision agreement represented by the supervision chair, and we start at the bottom. So it's a sort of bottom-up approach, and we start with the chair legs. And I suppose the chair legs are really about how is supervision going to be stable and predictable for me. So you don't want to arrive in your supervision chair and the legs break and you fall on the floor. You don't want to arrive in your supervision room, metaphorically, and there's no chair to sit on, or the chair that's usually in that space is somewhere else. So the legs of the chair are sort of the representation of the fact that we need supervision to hold people up, for it to be strong enough for people to be able to sit, express whatever they need to express, and it holds them, and it's stable and predictable. So the sorts of discussions that I would have at that stage of the supervision agreement are around, what do you need from me as a supervisor for your supervision to feel like it's stable, it's predictable, I'm available to you as a supervisor? You know, what are the sorts of things that are important to you in terms of predictability, for example? And, you know, so, and those are sort of prompt questions, if you like, starter questions. And who knows where they will take you, because it will be different with everybody. And you'll use all of your supervisor skills in terms of digging a bit deeper, exploring that a bit more. But essentially, it's the conversations around, what do you need for supervision to be predictable and stable, and for you to feel that you're available, that I'm available for you. So you mentioned, Siobhan, being an off-site practice educator, which I'm often off-site PE for students. And so how do they get hold of us when we're not in the team? Where is the sense of availability? If we are not available, who else would be? You know, do people need supervision to be really predictable in terms of knowing what the agenda is before they come, knowing what subjects are going to be discussed, or are they happier to go with the flow? So exploring those sorts of things is part of the sort of chair legs discussion. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I was smiling to myself because I could hear myself saying exactly those questions. I was thinking, gosh, I must have like incorporated that question so much that I always start off with that. What do you need from me in order to feel supervision is stable and predictable? And I do think that has led to some really interesting discussions, and it takes you into places that I don't think I'd have got, you know. I think that's one of the things I've felt since using the chair is I think it almost accelerates the quality of the relationship. Because of some
that's right. And that is a really common piece of feedback, that it actually accelerates that relationship building process. And if you think about, in the case of my work with students, we have 70 or 100 days to get to know someone, to understand them, to assess them, to help them learn, etc. So the quicker we build a rapport and get to know somebody, often the easier that is. So then I move on to the chair seat. So on top of the legs of the chair, we've got the seat, and the seat is really linked to the concepts of acceptance and membership, I suppose, and how the questions that I tend to ask are things like, what do we need to know about each other so we can sit comfortably in this supervision in this supervision relationship for 70 or 100 days in the case of students. So what do we need to know about each other? What's important for you to know about me, and vice versa? How are we going to learn more about each other over our supervisions in the future? Because one of the really important things for me about the supervision chair is that it's something that we go back to, that influences every supervision that we go on to do. So we're constantly trying to pay attention to, how can we learn more about each other? How can we ensure that we're thinking about things like the seat of power and privilege? So we're sitting in these metaphoric supervision seats, but we each have some power, and we each have privilege. What are those powers and privileges? Where do they come from? And how might they impact on our supervisory relationship? So I guess for me, a big part of this is, how do we model that these conversations are really important in supervision, but there's also a mirror here to our work with service users. So those conversations about sitting comfortably with each other are equally relevant to our working relationships with service users. And when I say comfortably, I also mean comfortable enough to have difficult conversations, because I'm not saying that we're always going to feel soft and snuggly and comfortable in supervision, because we have to have some tricky conversations. So how might we manage it if there's some challenge or if there's some conflict? And in my experience, we're more likely to be able to manage that if we have some sense of security and trust and knowledge of each other. And the other thing that I talk about when we're having discussions around the seat is, how do our values and beliefs, our life experiences, our work experiences, our cultural similarities or differences, how might they impact on supervision? And so at this point in the chair, I tend to use some discussion around social graces by John Burnham, and I have 5 sort of helpful, what I think are helpful questions that I might use at this point. It's a really good opportunity to introduce students to social graces or workers to social graces if they're not familiar with it. But so I tend to ask things like, which social graces are visible in this relationship and which are invisible? What are we interested in about that? How might it impact the way we work together? Do any of our social graces provide us with more power or privilege than the other one? How might that impact? And really importantly, I always ask, is there anything that you really need me to keep in mind about your social graces? What do you need me to understand about them and your life experience with them, or your fears or your worries about them in this area of work? And I think for me, that's led to some really fascinating conversations. It's led me to have conversations about difference in age, particularly because, you know, I'm usually nowadays older than anyone that I'm supervising. And if I'm supervising someone that is the same gender as my children or the same age as my children, I've had some really interesting discussions and reflections around that. And actually, what do I need to be aware of if I'm supervising someone that's very similar to one of my daughters? What might that trigger in me? So being what might it trigger in a student if I'm the same age as one of their parents? And then obviously you've got class and culture, and one of a student that I was supervising really identified as working class, and it was really, really important to her. And for me, you know, I identify, my background is very working class. You know, my father was a lorry driver. My mum was a stay-at-home mum. I was the first person in my family to go to university. What difference does it make to me if a student says to me, I'm working class, I'm the first person to go to my, what does that trigger in me? And having those discussions and how might it impact on them in placement? So, and there are a lot, you know, and I think, you know, in terms of, for me as a white woman, in terms of having supervisory discussions with students who are maybe from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background, that actually acknowledging white privilege, which is a really tricky thing to do, but having those conversations right from the start, and keeping those conversations on the agenda and trying to understand differences and similarities and the possible impacts of those. So for me, the seat is that place. How are we going to sit together and make this work and get to know each other?
Yeah,
does that make sense, Siobhan?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I find that a really interesting area of discussion. As you say, I do think that there's lots of conversations that come up that wouldn't come up without that, you know. So yeah, I've learned a lot, and I think that's maybe the part where it does accelerate that getting to know one another when you're talking about the seat of the chair. So yes, yeah, and I think it's a great analogy, you know, so that we can sit comfortably together. What do we actually need to know from one another? I think the analogy works with the chair there really well.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that bit about then keeping on the agenda, how do we continue to get to know each other and understand each other? So absolutely keeping that on the agenda for each supervision, however you choose to do that, whatever suits you best in the relationship. So then working upwards, the chair arms are what comes next. And the arms are really about the sort of containment, being sensitive to people's emotions, feelings, that sort of thing. And so the sorts of questions the sort of discussion we might have might be around, what do you need from me as your supervisor to feel accepted or supported or emotionally contained within supervision? What's your story with emotional containment? What's your story with support? You know, really trying to understand, what are you coming with in terms of that? What's been your experience? What do you need? What works for you? How will I know if you feel emotionally supported and contained by this supervision? What might that look like? So it's a good opportunity to discuss previous experiences of supervisory relationships, particularly, and how they've impacted on people's ability to feel that that supervision is emotionally supportive for them. Often I might ask questions like, you know, if you imagine these chair arms as supportive and emotionally containing, what colour might they be? What material might they be? What might it feel like when you sit down in the chair? So really trying to just expand and pull out those discussions about, what does emotional containment support? What does it look like for you? How can I try and do that for you? What's going to happen if you don't feel emotionally supported? What's going to happen if we're not quite getting that right? How are you going to tell me that? And again, just having those conversations around permission, really, like, actually, I want to know if this isn't okay for you, because then I want to do something about it. So being really explicit about, yes, supervision is about challenge and learning and all of those, but ultimately we want you to feel supported within whatever discussion we're having. And I had a supervisee once who said to me, and she like me, very visual learner, very creative and imaginative, and she said to me, the arms, she said something along the lines of, the arms would be, you know, big and fluffy, and they'd be pink, and they'd feel really comfortable, and they'd hug me, but there'd be a lever on them, and I'd be able to pull the lever and they'd just spring open a bit, and they'd let me fly. They'd just let me go off and, you know, make mistakes and come back and discuss them and have the arms back around me. And so, you know, and then we were able to have discussions about, so what might that feel like, and where does that come from, and have you had experiences where that hasn't happened before? So again, I think it's led me to have discussions with people that I might not have had otherwise.
I tell you, the question in that part, in the arms of the chair, for me, that it sounds obvious, I think, now, but when I first saw it, I thought it was such a crucial question for me. So, you know, starting off by, how would you, you know, how do you feel emotionally contained? What do you need from me to feel emotionally contained? What does that look like for you? But for me, the crucial question that I think I'd never really asked before was, how will you know that that's happening? And how will I know that that's happening? Because I think I would have gone as far as, what do you need from me to feel contained? And what will that look like? But I suppose, as a supervisor, you can feel like you're providing a really emotionally safe space, but maybe if the person doesn't feel that, how can they share that? So for me, that was a real crucial question, and that's led to lots of conversation. And I suppose that's been one of the things for me about the chair, is that there's been questions and aspects within it that I wouldn't have had those discussions around before, which has been, you know, really helpful as a tool for me. So then I know what's coming next, because literally, as I say this, I always sit up more straight like that as it gets to this part.
You're absolutely sitting in the supervision chair today, aren't you?
Yeah, it does look like that.
So then you put the back of the chair on. So the back of the chair is about paying attention, staying engaged, concentrating. But ultimately, that thing that we're often told, or I was told a lot as a child, is sit up straight and pay attention. So this is the bit about what just is going to help you to pay attention in supervision. And by that, I mean, stay engaged with it, feel like it's interesting enough to keep your attention. So this is really about, in terms of secure base, that sort of cooperation. How are we both going to pay attention to the learning and the discussion, etc., that we're having in supervision. So, I mean, in sort of some previous supervision agreements that I've used, it might be referred to as ground rules, for example, which I personally don't like, but it's that type of section. So it's things like, what do you need to help us stay? What do you need to pay attention in supervision? What works for you? So that's an opportunity to talk about learning styles, thinking styles, whether people need fidget toys in supervision, whether you're like me, you need a glass of water all the time, whether you need snacks, whether you need a break in supervision. What are the things that help you to stay engaged with supervision? Does just knowing the agenda and what we're going to discuss, or having some preparation work, does that help you to stay engaged? So, how are we going to utilize our possibly different or similar thinking styles, learning styles, etc., in supervision? As a practice educator, I tend to do quite a lot of activities in supervision around a particular theory or reflective model or something, but actually, how does that fit with what my supervisee might need? And it's a good opportunity to talk about, so what has helped you, or what helps you in general, to stay focused and engaged in a conversation or in supervision? What are your experiences? What experiences have you had of just not feeling engaged and it's really hard work because, and what was it that was making that happen? How can we sort of do that differently? So are there any barriers for you that we need to work together to overcome in terms of being engaged and concentrating? And also, I guess one of the things that comes in here are those keeping the chair alive, in terms of, so at each supervision, so what's going on for you today in terms of your ability to be engaged? What do I need to take into account? How are you arriving, and how is that going to impact on our ability to do this supervision session? And then nearly finally, when you sit in a chair, you have to get into it and you have to get out of it. So as you know, Siobhan, I'm always talking about how important beginnings and endings are. The whole process is important, but how important it is to try and start right and to try and end right. And so the supervision chair gives us an opportunity to just think about rituals and routines that might be helpful for us in how we begin supervision and how we end supervision. I think that's really applicable also to work with people with lived experience when you're doing home visits, for example, or meetings. What routines and rituals generally help people to feel like something's safe and predictable. Generally, if we end in a similar way each time, someone knows that the ending is about to happen, rather than us just saying, right, okay, time to leave now, bye-bye. So this is the opportunity for us to talk about what activity or ritual might help you to settle into supervision, settle into your supervision chair at the beginning of our session, and to leave the chair at the end of the session. Now, often when I ask that question, I get a blank look and people are like, well, I don't know, I've got no idea. Because sometimes their experience of supervision has been that someone just asked them how they were at the beginning and summed up action points at the end. So actually what I'm talking about is something potentially quite different to that. So I'll often give some ideas and choices, and we might not make a decision when we're actually doing this. The supervisee might well need to go away and just have a think about, what might I like? So I might suggest, like you, Siobhan, that is one of your ideas, a postcard or a picture that you bring to every supervision, a postcard or an online image or a picture that just represents how you feel today or something that's gone on for you. I might suggest something like using a particular reflective model or question at the beginning or the end of a session. I might suggest at the end of the session, I quite often use achievement moments. So what's been your best achievement since we met last? I write it down on a card and pop it in the achievements box. And at the end of our supervisory relationship, the person takes the box away with them. It might be a mindfulness activity, might be a bit of a breathing activity, or using an activity from a mindfulness app to start the session. But just having that discussion about what might help you settle in and what might help you leave at the end. But it's also an opportunity to think about how are we going to remember the main points from supervision. So you can do your practical sort of who's writing the minutes, what's the most helpful way to do that? What's the most helpful way to record action points? How will supervision minutes get shared? Those sorts of things. Some people I've worked with have said, actually, what really works for me is if we just handwrite the action points on a piece of paper at the end of supervision and I take them away with me. I prefer that than having it written on the minutes or to work with the minutes. So, so that's the sort of way in which the chair takes account of the beginning and the ending of each supervision, because as you know, beginnings and endings are all around us. We started this call, we'll end this call, that they're just constant throughout our working day. So this is just about acknowledging what might help with that. And I think it can help workers and students think a bit more about how do I do that in everyday practice with people as well. How do I just acknowledge beginnings and endings a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I tend to have some review questions, because I've talked about the fact that the supervision chair is a sort of working activity that I revisit in supervisions. So we might agree, for example, with the student, we might agree we'll do a formal review of the supervision chair at the midway point. But even if I've agreed that, I have certain questions that I try and remember to ask at each supervision. So at the end of supervision, I might say something like, how comfortable did the supervision chair feel today? What could I do, or what could we do together to improve the supervision chair for next time? What aspects of the chair do we need to start paying more attention to? So if we're suddenly feeling actually we haven't done a lot about continuing getting to know each other, or we need to revisit some of that social graces or power stuff, then let's pay more attention to that aspect of the chair next time we meet. And how can we do that? What activity could we use? What discussion, what reflective model or whatever could we use to help us pay more attention to that? So a way that I do that helps me remember is in my template that I create for supervision and the agenda. I have those questions just standardly at the end. So we do a little review of what did it feel like? What do we need to do differently next time? And you can obviously adjust those questions to what suits you and your supervisee. But I find that's a really helpful thing, just to keep reviewing it and holding it in mind. It can be helpful for the concentration element of supervision. How are we doing with that engagement? Do we need to do things differently? What's working, what's not working? So reviewing really important as well.
Yeah. And I absolutely love the chair, and I don't think I review it every session, but I do every other session, maybe ask how did the chair feel today. And I like those formal reviews as well of the chair. Say when I'm working with a student before the midpoint meeting, we'll have a formal review of the chair, talk about that, look at that. And as you say, I think it has just led to some really interesting discussions and opened up lots of ideas for me. The getting in and out of the chair for me has been probably the thing that's had the most impact. I think students have been so creative in that, ideas for getting in and out. And I do find it interesting that when I do this with very experienced workers, they're often less creative and less, it's just, oh, well, that's how you start and that's how you end. Well, no, it doesn't have to be. We could imagine it differently. We could do it differently. Yeah. And some of the ideas that students have brought have been really creative, you know. So I think that's been very interesting, and I've found things out about students and what they like very quickly from those conversations. I remember there was a student who really liked to end things with like an inspirational quote or a bit of an affirmation. So she would bring along an affirmation, and that was really interesting. I found that was something I'd not really worked with before, but
Yeah.
I got quite into that as well. So, yeah, I just think it's a fascinating tool, really. I don't know if I've told you this before, but there's a couple of places where I deliver a group supervision or a reflective space. And in those areas, they're very used to the chair. I don't think they all have their own chair, but they know of the chair, and they use the chair. A few of them do have their own chair in place. But we've adapted it slightly to talk about tables. So we've looked at what does everybody bring to the table, who's responsible for laying the table, who clears the table
Oh,
afterwards,
wow.
do we each share at the table. So that's been really helpful as well, at just taking that, bringing that analogy a little bit further, that when you're coming together,
Yeah.
because I think the image that you have on the template it's literally a chair just
It
like
is.
this.
I know.
It's just the chair in my office. I have two chairs like this. So if people come here for supervision, then yeah, we have literally those chairs. So we talk about the fact that when coming together in supervision, it may just be two of you in a comfortable chair like this, but when you
Yeah.
come together, you'd often come to a table, and there is the
Yeah.
responsibility before and after and who does what, because
Yeah.
in those spaces I set them up, but then they become self-sustaining, and one person might be responsible for taking the notes one week, and another person's responsible for the preparation that week. So and that's been a really helpful way, again, of accelerating and everybody understanding what this is about. And I
Yeah.
think you use an analogy that is so obvious. We all sit in chairs, we all use a chair in some way. So when you're using an analogy that is really clear, but it gives you that depth and that grounding, I think it's so helpful. It really builds on that law of association stuff, doesn't it? In learning. So I just think it's brilliant that the whole tool is just really, really helpful for people. So thank you for sharing it. Is there anything else you would want to say about the chair, or your thoughts around the chair? Even I know you've had lots of feedback about it. I don't know if you wanted to share any of that or.
Yeah, I have had quite a lot of feedback. I mean, supervisors have said to me that they feel it helps to stress supervision as a joint endeavour, that that they find it a more equal, reciprocal thing to do than a traditional, if you like, supervision agreement. I've had people say that they feel it really helped them develop a rapport with their supervisee quickly, and that really helped them navigate difficulties in practice or placements in the case of students later on down the line, because they felt they had more of a secure base or understanding of each other. I've had students in my case say that they felt clearer about what supervision was, particularly if you are supervising someone who is coming into social care and this concept of supervision is actually, alien to them. And the element of relationship within that is sometimes something that they're not expecting. They're expecting it to be purely about their work and their practice, which of course supervision is, but they're not expecting that basis of relationship within that. And I've had students and supervisees that have said it's really helped them to understand the sort of safe reciprocal place that supervision can be.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing that's happened is that some of our practice educators that have used this have said that with hindsight, looking back on previous, maybe some difficulties they had with supervising a student, before having used the chair. Then when they've used the supervision chair, they've thought to themselves, actually, if I'd have had some of these conversations with that student earlier on, I might have understood or been able to manage what then came later. And so that's really lovely, I think, as feedback, being able to think, yes, maybe I could have managed that differently if I'd known certain things about that person that I was supervising before. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll put the links below the video for the book, and so that people will be able to utilise the chair and develop the chair. So thank you so much for sharing and for joining me today. I'm sure people will find it really helpful. I think it's one of those tools as well that you need to hear about, and you need to experience it to really see the value of it. I think that's definitely true. And I now value it so much that the person that supervises me, I asked them, can we develop a chair? Even though we've had supervision for a long time, I just felt it would be really helpful from my perspective as well. So, I think it can be just such a helpful tool. It is really, really helpful. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for asking me, Siobhan. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I do hope you've enjoyed today's slice of supervision. Here's how to follow me. See you again soon.